Between my sophomore and junior years at Pratt, this is in Ken's voice, not mine, I got a residency in Aspen, Colorado, and went out west for the first time. At that time, Aspen was this funky old mining town with a little ski resort. I rented a giant chicken coop from the oldest lady in town. She was 95 and would tell me these stories about when it was a silver mining town, and I loved it. The art school itself was terrible. The woman and guy who ran it were like Eva Braun and Hitler. I started having a thing with this girl there, Peggy, a very cool, sophisticated New Yorker who came from one of those super rich Upper West Side households where the parents are in the arts. We became very close with the model at the school and her boyfriend. One night we said, let's just get out of here. We packed our bags and we snuck out. We drove a while and ended up in the Four Corners where Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet, that magical zone. We decided to get stoned and watch the sunrise in the desert, our car parked alongside this endless stretch of empty road. The landscape was totally flat and open, with a mountain in the distance. We just sat there on the car watching the sky. I saw a star. What star is that? It's so bright. Not Mars. No, it's not Mars. Venus? But it can't be Venus. It's too big. Then it got bigger and bigger. And then it got bigger. Soon it was cigar-shaped with a green glow and flashing lights. Our jaws dropped. There was all this light, and then it came down in front of the mountain making this sound. We were really far away, so this thing must have been huge. Then it leveled out above the ground. Then it went straight up in the air. It was gone in like a second. We're sitting there like, what did we just see? Could that have been... This was before the word UFO was even coined, and they were still called flying saucers. The next day on the radio, 100,000 people called it in. It turned out to be one of the largest sightings of any UFO ever. I didn't fact check that, by the way. The photograph of it is one of the 5 UFO photographs that can't be disproved. There's no way to describe what happens when you see one of those things. This was 1965. My whole sense of history changed. If these things had been visiting this planet for a millennium, which they obviously had been, that means that there's a left-out period of history that we don't know anything about. From there, we all headed to LA, and then Peggy and I took the bus to San Francisco. I was wearing sandals when Peggy and I got out of the bus, and I stepped on something sharp. It was a beautiful little handmade silver UFO charm. I stepped right on it, and that cinched it. That completely changed my way of thinking. Art, like a religious object, can be imbued with its own sense of power. What makes an object religious? The fact that people revere it and give energy to it. That energy is there. It's invisible and it's abstract, but it's there. After I saw the UFO, my path changed overnight. I decided I wasn't going to believe anything ever again and would dedicate myself to finding the unbelievable, the unknown, and the invisible. So that's that for now. I wanted to read a part of the interview where that story came from. So we're sitting there and Ken was telling me about being in the Four Corners with Peggy. They're all stoned. He says something about the landscape being a dead ringer for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I don't really know that reference. In the real story, Ken was in the car with his friends, but when I wrote it later, I placed them lying on top of the car, because that's how I imagined it, even though he told me otherwise. Ken likes the mistake, and we decide to keep it. But in the transcript, in the interview, they're in the car. I look at the star, and I said, what star is that? It's so bright. We're looking, not Mars. No, it's not Mars. Well, Venus, it can't be Venus. It's too big. Then it got bigger, and it got bigger, and it got bigger and bigger. Soon it was cigar-shaped with a green glow and lights. We're all sitting there with our jaws dropped. Then he goes on and he talks about the UFO, how it hovered in front of a mountain, how it went shh, how it went shh. And then he says, the next thing that happened cemented this change in my life. We had dropped our friends off in LA, and Peggy and I took the bus up to San Francisco. We got out of the bus. I stepped on something when I got out of the bus, something sharp. I was wearing sandals. It's a UFO, a silver UFO charm that did not look like the UFO that I saw, but was a little beautiful handmade silver charm. It's probably still around here somewhere in this apartment. Steps right on it. That was it. I knew it was a sign of something. At that, I kind of noiselessly gulp and say, almost in a whisper, "Do you think there are spirits in objects?" And Ken says, "Absolutely I do." And then I say, relieved, "Okay, me too." After this, I tell everyone I know the UFO story. One friend says she's been watching a documentary about UFOs, and she'll send me the link if I'm okay with New Agey. I tell her to send it. I want to be like Ken and attract the supernatural. It's helpful for me to think about other worlds right now, I say. Instead of watching the UFO documentary, I watch like 6 episodes of Law & Order Special Victims Unit. I tell my friends, see, this is why I need the supernatural. I have a job interview for an oral historian position. The HR person asks me, "What's your favorite interview you ever did?" Horrible question, I have no answer for this. So I tell her the UFO story. She interrupts me, "Did you turn off the tape recorder and run the other way?" I don't get the job. In February, I spent some weeks making a performance with some people to respond to the election. I write the UFO story out in one of the workshops and we use it in our performance. We also use my Special Victims Unit spiel, which I don't watch at all while I'm working on this performance. I hear these stories over and over. After the last night of our performance, a friend of mine says something negative or something about Proust that I can't remember now, about Proust. I called her up yesterday, actually, to see if she could remember what she said. All I remember is that you said you loved Proust, and I felt stupid because I hadn't read Proust. And you said, "He's gay, come on," and different from the others. I told her, well, I just felt stupid because I was defending Proust. I mean, how much Proust had I even read? Just the first book. That one line I had used in a paper. I used it a lot, actually. "The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, in some material object which we do not suspect. And as for that object, it depends on chance, whether we come upon it or not, before we ourselves must die." In that paper I had explained, Proust describes the past as something we can't simply decide to understand. It emerges from the landscape of our lives when it is ready to, as if controlled by larger, invisible forces. Okay, now I'm going to come into the present a little bit. March 22nd, 2017. After work, I'm feverishly catching up on texts on the subway platform at Rockefeller Center. As I'm standing there, a woman slides head first right in front of my feet. She was running down the stairs to catch the train, phone in hand, and she fell right onto her stomach, arms outstretched in front of her, just centimeters away from the train. "Are you okay?" I'm freaked out. I bend down to try and help her. She laughs, she gets herself up, she does not look at me, and she walks away. My heart's still beating when I get on the next train. I hear a loud voice. A man is telling everyone on the train a story. I move closer. He says, he's really amused with himself. He says, "A woman goes into a shop. There's a bag of mackerel on the counter. What do you want?" the shop clerk asks. She says, "Bum, bum." He can't understand what she's saying. "I'm sorry, miss, what can I help you with?" "Bum, bum." He says to the shopkeeper, "Can you help this woman out?" The shopkeeper greets her. "Good evening, ma'am. What can I help you with?" "Bum, bum." "I'm sorry, ma'am. I really can't understand you." She sticks her fingers in the mackerel and then up to the man's nose. "Holy mackerel," he shouts. £5, she says. Now he can hear her. It's not that funny, really, of a story. And it's not really worth repeating, and it doesn't make much sense. But it makes me remember something in that moment. When he said mackerel, I thought of a poem by my poetry professor at Mills College, Elizabeth Willis. She had read it to the class one day. This was before it was later published. I don't remember it having a title, but then I look up the words mackerel and Elizabeth Willis, and I find the poem. And it's called Clash by Night. A good man's up to his waist in mackerel. Sometimes there are no other fish in the sea. A storm cloud roils over his primitive kitchen. Her eyes are starlight, headed for a crash. She wants the part, but not for long. Dancing shows everyone where she comes from. The projectionist is a dark horse, but he's at home there. The pin-up's a bunny in jeans, drinking milk, thinking up babies, a lesson in endurance. The martyr trades her wings for a day at the beach, but who can blame her? You can't reform a lighthouse. The worker knows he's been gulled. His catch is no match for noir. I remember Elizabeth Willis and how she was so kind to me, how shy and vulnerable she was when she read this poem to a room full of judgmental students. But in my memory of it, it was a woman up to her waist in Mackerel, not a man. And I remember thinking, is this a poem about her and her husband breaking up? About how everyone is telling her there are plenty of fish in the sea, but all she sees is mackerel? And I remember thinking that was very Sex and the City of her to write a poem about that. But then reading the poem now, I realized I misheard it entirely. I had taken a class with Elizabeth's husband, the poet Peter Gizzi, at UC Santa Cruz the year before. In that class, there was a poet named Ryan. He had white blonde hair and his skin was the same color. He was very tall. He wrote poems, and in the poems, he called the poems poems, P-O-M-E-S. They were in a kid's voice. I remember there was a girl in the class whose poems were all about depression, but they only talked about buildings. They never said the word depression. All of her poems were in Courier font, which I found very striking, I remember. We all had to make little chapbooks at the end of the class. Mine was called In Waiting for My Period. I was going for a kind of goth Sylvia Plath. The chapbook was in Courier. I thought enough time had passed where I was safe to copy her. I was always thinking about if it was okay to copy someone.